learn about health topics and wellness topics so we can kind of take charge more of our own health. So we can go to the next slide, actually, and we'll just cover briefly some CH community updates, and then we'll go ahead right into the talk. So you can go to the next one, and then Q&A after that. One more. So in coronavirus, so this is a slide I do for most of the talks. I think I skipped it last week, but nationally, unfortunately, there are reportedly 216,000 deaths. Cases are holding steady and actually declining some in Maryland. I just spoke to some people today at the hospital. It seems like things are steady here. There are no FDA-approved antiviral treatments for coronavirus, but from an integrative perspective, there are many ways to optimize the immune system. We know that the multiple inputs can nourish the system and send a message of safety to the cells, what we call building the terrain. And so we look at lifestyle medicine, functional medicine, nutrition, acupuncture, herbal medicine, mushrooms is on there too, yoga. You could type in the chat box. I think we did this 2 or 3 weeks ago, but type in the chat box because not everyone's here last couple of weeks. What are your favorite ways to build the terrain, your terrain of your body? And you know, I think that's one thing. We can go to the next slide as you kind of think about that, and anything you'd like to share in the chat box would be appreciated. This is one way to build the terrain, to get outside in nature, get some sun exposure, get out in the fresh air right here. Walking, yes, thank you for that. Definitely walking, earthing, you know, connecting to the earth before it gets too cold, hopefully. And also many other things too. Hiking, yes. Getting down, meditation and EMDR, regular exercise. Thank you for all those comments. Yeah, so there's many ways to do that. And I think we can go to the next slide. Nutrient-dense foods, absolutely. We do have a virtual group visit coming up with Araceli and Ayla, 2 of our integrative and functional nutritionists here, who are great. If you haven't met them yet, this is a great way to meet them. We're going to be talking about optimizing gut health. And again, if people don't know this already, optimizing gut health is important for the immune system as well, because your immune cells are mostly residing in your gut. They're kind of like the residents of your gut, essentially. That's Tuesday, October 20th from 4 to 5:30 p.m. That is built to insurance and it's on Zoom, so please join us for that. If you're interested in that, you can message CIH main inbox to have a request to join that. We'd love to see you there. So your tummy can feel happy, just like that person on the right. And then orthomolecular medicine, so super therapeutic doses of vitamins. A recent study that will be published preprint in Pulmonology in 2020 that was done in 3 hospitals in China, that's a randomized controlled clinical trial of intravenous vitamin C, showed that people that received 12 grams of IV vitamin C every 12 hours for 7 days, and these were people that were very, very sick. They were in the ICU in China. They were hospitalized with COVID. A lot of them were on ventilators and things like that. So 19% of the people that got treated with a vitamin C for up to a week died, but 36% of the people that received sterile water died. So there was a 60% more likelihood that the people that were on IV vitamin C were able to survive. This is something that we feel is a safe treatment. It's not completely researched the way that we would like it to research, but there's a lot of trials happening. So we would like that to happen here in the US, more IV vitamin C in the hospitals. I'm not sure if it's happening now, but this is just one piece of evidence that shows that it can help in world research. So we can go to the next slide. And then our October schedule, we've had quite a few visits already for October for the wellness webinar. Next week's going to be Dr. Keats, which is a date change from Thursday, which we have a professional day there. We have a wellness webinar, Thriving Fridays, or we can call it some other fun Friday or something like that. October 23rd, Dr. Keats will be talking about breast cancer prevention. And then on October 29th, Dr. Kaiser will be talking about osteopathic medicine for health as well. So thank you for that. So we're going to go to the next slide. And then Liz and Jared, take it away with the rise of psychedelics in healthcare. Really excited to hear about this topic and learn a lot more.
Well, welcome everybody. We're going to be talking about the rise of psychedelics in healthcare, and it's a really fun topic. There's a lot to talk about, but first we will introduce ourselves. My name is Liz Baer. I'm an acupuncturist, I'm a Reiki master, and I'm certified in psychedelic assisted therapy and research with the California Institute of Integral Studies.
Hey everybody, my name is Jared Urchek. I'm also an acupuncturist, naturalist, and a mycologist, and an herbalist as well. And I like to focus on a lot of the you know, not only the great herbal benefits of mushrooms, but also just getting out in the woods and, you know, getting out in the woods and getting that nature medicine as well. So yeah, happy to be doing this talk with Liz, and thanks so much to CIH here.
Yeah. Before we get started, we want to just be very clear that Jared and I are not researchers. We're not experts, although we do hold a certain amount of knowledge that I think may be interesting to share today. And it's always important to do a quick disclaimer that lets you know that we do not endorse any use of psychedelic medicine outside of a legal setting, which is research setting, or in a country or part of our country where it's decriminalized or legal to be used. So psychedelics mean many things to many people, and it's a enormous topic, growing by the day. And there are a lot of psychedelics to talk about. But today, really, our goals for you are to kind of perk your interest in the subject, to give you some background on why psychedelics are showing up right now and where they've come from, and also to look into the future of how they are going to be affecting both mental health care in the future in a greater way, and also potentially integrative health at some point as well. So we hope you will leave with more curiosity, that you want to go and explore this a little bit more. Well, as you've noticed, and maybe why you're here, is that psychedelics are in a bit of a renaissance. And we are getting national attention for psychedelics from pharma companies, from researchers, government organizations like the FDA and the DEA. And there are thousands of regular folks just like you and I who are seeking it out both near and far for therapeutic use for some reason. So we'd like to know what brings you guys here today. Is it something that you've seen on the news? Do you have a personal experience with it? Is it curiosity? We'd love to see what you guys are looking for. So Jen's going to put up a poll. I think you see it now. And I think you're able to check more than one. So. So you may have been, okay, so let's see what's coming in. You are someone you know suffers with mental health. So far, not many people have are coming here because of the media or decriminalization campaign. And there's a lot of curious people. So I'm assuming that you're hearing people talk about it in your worlds and you want to know more. Okay, well, so hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions. I gotta go to the next slide. So one good place to start is to kind of explore the word of psychedelic, the psychedelic, you know, what does that mean to you? Because a lot of people have different types of connotations. So you can put your words or images in the chat box and we'll look at those, but here are some words that have come up to us when we've been talking about psychedelics with other people. You can see on one end, there's some negative connotations like risky or counterculture. You know, sometimes hippies are considered negative, but then you have some neutral ones. And then you also have some really positive ones like breakthrough and healing, insights, things like that.
Someone saying far out and also the 60s as a...
yeah. Any others, Jared? I'm not sure I can see them, so you let me...
counterculture, colors.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. So they mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But one of the questions is what does psychedelic actually mean? Because before I went to school, I actually didn't really know what it meant. Apparently there's no exact definition of it, but if we break down the word, we can see that psyche means mind and soul, and delic means revealing and manifesting. So it gives us this hint that psychedelics have something to do with the deep understanding of self. There's something about them that brings us into ourself and into our experience and reveals something that was not already apparent. And this may be why the FDA has designated psychedelics as a breakthrough therapy for some particularly vexing health issues that we don't have other ways of treating effectively. So there are about 100 psychedelics in existence, and they come from a variety of sources. You may be most familiar with psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. You also probably know about LSD, but there is a whole host of other ones that are like really far out. So there's 5-MeO-DMT, which is extracted from the parotid gland of the Sonoran desert toad. It's known as the most intense psychedelic on the planet. There's also DMT, which you may have heard of, that comes from Amazonian brew called ayahuasca. There's mescaline from peyote, and there are others that are not technically psychedelics, but have that mind soul manifesting quality to them. And those are things like ketamine, which is already a Schedule 4 substance and being used for suicidality, cannabis, which we know people use for pain and anxiety and depression, and MDMA, which is used in a lot of PTSD trials. All of the psychedelics and those ones that are sort of near psychedelic act on the brain serotonin receptors, creating a dreamlike hallucinogenic state of altered time and space perception, emotion, and cognition. And if any of you have read the Michael Pollan book or looked online about psychedelics, very often this term ego death comes up. We may touch on it a little bit later, and if you want to ask questions about it afterwards, that's great. We'd like to answer them. But it does sound a little bit scary, and it brings me to this question of like, why would anybody want to do psychedelics to begin with? Well, people report consistently feelings of transcendence, a sense of stronger connections with others in the world, a greater sense of self and story. And one researcher that I know very well up at Hopkins, she's been doing this work for a very, very long time and seen hundreds of patients. She says that one thing that's very consistent is this sense of love that appears when you're on the substance, that there's this connection to something quite greater than self when being in a treatment with psychedelic medicine. So how the mind manifesting substances create a background for healing mental illness is something we're going to go talk in more detail later. But first, we'd like to kind of explore and maybe answer the question of why psychedelics are coming up so much these days. As you may have noticed, there's a tremendous surge of interest in the topic. So it may be that this was really surprising to me when I saw this statistic, that there are 30 million Americans who used a psychedelic in their lifetime. And when you look at it, that's 15% of Americans. I had no idea that this was the case because people don't really talk about it very often, right? And these include folks who have done research. These are, of course, people who grew up in the 60s and 70s. But there are also, again, people just like you and me who are traveling far, far distances sometimes, across the world to find some sort of therapeutic experience by using a psychoactive medicine like this.
Jen, there's a question here. CBD and THC be considered psychedelics? And as my understanding, THC is not considered a psychedelic, but you might have more to say about that.
That's a good question. I think my friend Anna's on here. I wish she would answer that question for me because she does. She knows that topic really well. I know that there's a guy named Daniel McQueen out in Boulder, Colorado, who definitely views cannabis as a psychedelic, and the active ingredient, the psychoactive ingredient, is THC. So I think I wouldn't want to speak for him, but it makes me think that yes, it is a psychedelic substance. But as we'll talk about it later, it all depends on how you create a set and setting for the experience when you have it. That's there's rituals around it which can make the substance much more mind expanding.
I was going to say something similar. I mean, there's even some cultures I've heard of that use coffee as a psychedelic.
Yeah.
A really high dose. And I mean, we don't think of coffee as a psychedelic, and yet, based on your definition of psychedelic, any substance that helps you consider yourself more deeply or see yourself more deeply can be used as a psychedelic, like you said, in proper set and setting.
And same thing with cacao. You have cacao ceremonies, and I mean, even I think Jared and I would argue that acupuncture and Chinese medicine, depending on the tradition from which the practitioner is working, can be very mind altering and almost psychedelic in nature. I think we've probably both seen that on our table.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So there are other reasons, aside from them being like personally popular with Americans. And these are sort of cultural shifts that have been happening over the past decades. And one of them is that, you know, mental health is at a breaking point, and the medicines that we've been using up until this point really aren't working very well. They're just not that reliable. They work for some people, but really don't reliably work for all people. There are thousands of veterans with PTSD who are dying needlessly, and specifically with trauma, some of the techniques that we have therapeutically in psychology, they're also not very consistently helpful, unfortunately, for trauma. So we have a lot of people who are just suffering and don't have a lifeline at this point. There's an epidemic of addiction and of disconnection, which I think about a lot. You know, this epidemic of loneliness, really, that we have, and lack of meaning as we trudge through our days and our activities, the same ones day to day. And then lastly, we have a history of promising research over the last 30 years that's finally coming to light. And it's coming to light because the results are very exciting and kind of, in some cases, sort of mind-blowing. So we'll show you some of that later. If you've done a psychedelic, this picture might make you think back to an experience, but we're going to use this as our transition to go back in time. And Jared's going to give us a history lesson about psychedelics, specifically mushrooms, but here we go.
Yeah, so let's take a little brief trip back in time here and talk about sort of some of the prehistory of, you know, how did our culture, how did our species interact with these substances, you know, in times before. And I'll mention too, Christine asked about us touching on moving through trauma with psychedelics, and that will come up, especially with, I think, some MDMA research and some other things we'll talk about, as well as a question about, can psychedelics be supplemented with a patient receiving electrical cortical therapy, a pacemaker, defibrillator stuff, so maybe you can touch on that.
Yeah, we'll try to do that. Most important takeaway is, even though it seems new to us in some ways in this Western world, psychedelics have been around for a very, 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 very long time.
Yeah. So yeah, psychedelics have been around for a very long time. I'm going to skip over to my notes, and maybe you can skip the slides for me.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, so
yeah, psychedelics have been around for such a long time. You know, this picture that we have in front of you, it looks like some kind of bee shaman, right? That's sort of the colloquial name that has been given to this painting. This painting was found on a cave in southeastern Algeria, and it's dated to be somewhere around 6000 BCE, right? This is a long, long, long time ago that we have this cave art, and there's other cave art depictions of what are assumed to be sacred magical mushrooms. And, you know, we have this record of humans scribing these things on the walls, you know. There's another painting that I didn't put up here of some figures of humans kind of following buffalo herds and then holding these mushrooms as well. And we'll talk about that in an upcoming slide. So we have this record of, you know, of psychedelics being used through human history in a lot of different ways. We also have the Rig Veda over there on the right, and this quote from the Rig Veda, which is an ancient Vedic Hindu text, somewhere around 5000 BCE as well. And the quote is, "We drank soma, we became immortal, we came to the light, we found gods." Right? So that's a pretty provocative statement. I mean, that's not something you say after you go, you know, share a cup of tea with your friend. It's like, "Oh, how was tea?" "Yeah, well, you know, we drank some tea, we became immortal, we found gods, it was really great." You know, it's like, this is reflective of something that's really something very profound after having drank this soma. And so there's a lot of people that speculate that soma was a concentration of, you know, one or a couple of different medicinal mushrooms or magic mushrooms. And yeah, we just have this history all throughout. Skip through here. yeah, we have this history all throughout, and not only through typical vectors of, human interaction, but it's worth mentioning, as Liz said, we have hundreds of psychedelic compounds just distributed throughout nature. Um, there's a picture over here on the bottom left of a cicada, which we're all familiar with. We have the cicadas that come out periodically. And there's a fungus that attacks them and will actually inject small amounts of psilocybin and meth into these insects. And it actually encourages them to do this kind of odd mating dance, which encourages the other bugs to come close to those insects and spread that fungi around. So we've got all these different examples of fungi through history, of psychedelic fungi, psychedelic plants and cacti that people have been utilizing.
Yeah, I love this idea that, that we've been evolving with psychedelics throughout time, and that it's our body knows actually, and we'll see this later, but our body knows how to interact with it really well.
Yeah, we have this really deep level of engagement with that, and that's really well spoken of in this theory that we have that comes from Terence McKenna, who's one of the big theorists and proponents of psychedelic culture back in the 1900s, late 1900s, and he called this the stoned ape theory. And this is the idea that as our sort of pre-human ancestors came down from the trees as upper primates, as apes, we started chasing large prey animals around the prairie, buffalo, cattle, different things like this. And as we were chasing these animals around the prairie, hunting them, naturally we would find their cow patties, we would find their dung, right? And the dung of these animals is really a perfect habitat for these psychedelic fungi, these psychedelic mushrooms. Still, a lot of people today will run out to the cow pastures after rains to harvest their own wild ones. So it's a really common thing that humans have done throughout history. And Terence McKenna's idea was that, as humans were as pre-humans were chasing these animals and, finding their dung, finding the fungi that grew on their dung, they were ingesting these fungi, sometimes in large amounts, sometimes in small amounts. And just like Liz had said, we have this really long history of our ancestors, both human and pre-human, of our bodies taking these substances in and knowing what to do with them. So it's a really provocative theory. And I think it makes quite a lot of sense. So a little bit more modern history. Psychedelics really began to emerge in the Western consciousness with Gordon Wasson, this guy who was all the way on the right, who went down to visit this woman, Maria Sabina. She was a Mexican curandera, a medicine woman, who used medicinal mushrooms, who used these magic mushrooms in a really deeply religious sort of sacred context to use them to heal her people, heal her family, heal the villagers, who would come to see her. So Gordon Wasson, who was actually was kind of a big wig in J.P. Morgan and was also an amateur mycologist, because I think his wife was a Eastern European woman who was heavily into mushrooms from when she was younger. So they went to visit Maria Sabina and got introduced to these sacred mushrooms. And he wrote an article about it in Life magazine in 1957 that really kind of exploded in the Western consciousness. So, we really have Maria Sabina to thank for that. And it's also worth saying that, Gordon Wasson, there's, some indication that it wasn't like a really nice, pleasant transfer of culture, that it was more of an example of Gordon Wasson sort of going down and getting this information and this experience, and then sharing it in a way that kind of opened up Maria Sabina's village to people coming down in droves to try and get these mushrooms, to try and have these experiences, right? So it was less of a sort of balanced cultural exchange and more of an example of colonizing culture, unfortunately. So I think that's something that we really have to keep in mind as we move forward into the modern psychedelic era, to be able to balance the wisdom that the indigenous cultures give us with science, with the information that the science gives us as well.
Thanks for that, Jared. It's a really important one for us all too, especially, those of us who are going to be working in psychedelics, to remember where it came from. That there's a lineage, there's a lineage of it.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to the timeline?
Yeah, so that's a really good segue to the next slide. This is a really a very brief timeline of psychedelics in the modern sense. And if you're interested in this, there's a great link in the resources that's a really, really in-depth timeline if you're interested in going and looking through this. But the modern psychedelic timeline really starts with Albert Hofmann synthesizing LSD in 1943. He originally synthesized this thinking it was going to be a cardiovascular and respiratory drug, and then accidentally absorbed some through his skin, and then started to have this kind of small trip. And he thought, well, that was interesting. And being a scientist, the next day he decided to take what we now know is a megadose of LSD, and then rode his bike home through the countryside, tripping probably harder than most people had through history before him. And so that really opened up this, along with Gordon Wasson's article about Maria Sabina, this opened up a whole slew of research into these compounds. And there were studies that were done for addiction, studies that were done for depression, for PTSD, or what we now call PTSD. If you move through into the 1960s, we had the Harvard psychedelic studies where Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner and Ram Dass were bigwigs at Harvard, and they started giving psilocybin to interns, to graduate students, and also to a bunch of folks who we know are really towers in terms of our cultural history. Mm-hmm. People like Aldous Huxley, people like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Neil Cassidy. And so he, that crew really introduced psychedelics and psilocybin to culture in a way that had a profound impact on society as we know it.
I was going to say one thing that was, I think Pollan talks about in his book, but is that, AA's founder, Bill, he also experienced psychedelics at this time and was really excited about using it as a way of helping supplement the recovery of being an alcoholic. But I think didn't get a chance to take it any farther because of 1970.
Yeah, so, as psychedelics really kind of exploded onto the scene, there was a lot that kind of strayed less from the laboratory, less from the clinic into the street, basically. And there was a big pushback from the government at that point, since there was this, really huge resurgence or surge of psychedelics into mainstream culture. So in 1970, Nixon enacted the Controlled Substances Act, which unfortunately placed psilocybin, LSD, and a lot of these other drugs as Schedule I drugs, which, if you don't know the scheduling system, meant that they were scheduled as the most dangerous and the most restricted type of drug. More restricted than cocaine, more restricted than heroin, and more restricted than a lot of other drugs that are extremely dangerous. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So yeah, with the Controlled Substances Act, psychedelic research went completely underground and was completely halted with anything formal for many years, really until the early 2000s. And Liz, I may turn it over to you for that.
Sure. So in the early 2000s, human subject research began again, and psilocybin was the medicine of choice. I think LSD, from what I understand, the reputation was so negative that trying to get research with LSD was just not going to happen with the FDA. But psilocybin, I heard one researcher who started some of those studies again in the 2000s say that no one really knew what psilocybin was. It was such a weird name, and it wasn't called magic mushroom. So it was able to kind of like slide through a little bit more easily. So what makes magic mushrooms so magical? They have psychoactive components, psilocybin and psilocin, which is what lights our brains up, and it's what's been synthesized now to be used in the research trials. They turn off this filter in our brain called the default mode network. We're going to talk a little bit later about that, but basically when the default mode network turns off or is reduced, our ability to perceive our surroundings and make connections that weren't previously available to us, it explodes, essentially. It stimulates the visual cortex, which results in changes in our sense of time and space. Do you want to talk about synesthesia? Because that's a really fun one.
Yeah, synesthesia, if you all don't know synesthesia, it's this really fascinating experience, this phenomenon where senses converge. And so normally we smell things with our nose and we touch things with our skin, right? But synesthesia is where people actually have this experience of, say, being able to smell the way something sounds, or to be able to listen to the way that something tastes, right? So the chemistry of the brain, the sort of connections in our nervous system begin to blend together a little bit. Now, synesthesia is something that happens just in the normal general population. Some people are naturally synesthetic. It's a well-known phenomenon. And with psychedelics, we notice that the synesthesia really seems to happen a lot more effectively, or a lot more, it's more encouraged when under the experience of various psychedelics.
Yeah. The other thing that mushrooms tend to do is to loosen up our sense of self, which can be good for a lot of people, especially if we have a rigid way of thinking about ourselves, and allows you to reorganize your identification, like your ego structure. One of the ways that it does this is that it resembles the neurotransmitter serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter responsible for regulating our emotions and learning. So we'll show you on the next slide, but psilocybin and psilocin look really similar to serotonin. So we think that that's one of the ways in which we're able to light up these parts of the brain that create pleasure and reflection. And lastly, one of the things in a study that I looked at of all the different psychedelics, one thing that was notable about psilocybin is this quality of ineffability, which means that these experiences that happen are hard to put into words. They're beyond description. They're just what's happening here. Like, I'm thinking about them. You can't bring it into this reality in words because it's so transcendent. Yeah, I think that's how I might put it. I don't know about you, Jared, but
Yeah, I think that's how I'd put it too. And I was reflecting on this, and having had personal experiences with psychedelics, it's now hard for me to understand what it's like to not have that experience, you know, to not feel that connection that they can bring, and not to feel that level of ineffability.
Yeah.
It's now just as wild for me to think about that.
I hear you. So let's move on and show you what these neurotransmitters look like, and like these chemical structures of psilocybin and psilocin. Do you want to take this one, Jared?
Yeah. So psilocybin and psilocin are two compounds that are in magic mushrooms, as well as some other compounds, you know, some other substances. And in particular, psilocybin breaks down into psilocin. And actually, if you know anything about magic mushrooms, a lot of times they will have a blue color on them. And that blue color is actually the process of psilocybin breaking down into psilocin, being oxidized into psilocin in the mushroom, turns blue. And so psilocin is actually what is used in our body, in our neurotransmitters. And you can see that psilocybin there has such a clear resemblance to the serotonin molecule below it. It's almost the exact same, except for just a slight different nitrogen-hydrogen compound there on the end. So I'm not a chemist that can really break down exactly what that means or why that's interesting, but Liz and I were speaking about LSD, which is a really similar chemical to this, the similar chemical structure, except that it has a much longer sort of arm on it that apparently sort of wraps around and almost sort of locks this chemical into our neurotransmitters in a way that produces a much longer experience. You know, so somebody who takes LSD, they may have a 8-hour or a 16-hour experience because there's this chemical structure that's kind of almost locking that molecule in, as opposed to psilocin and serotonin, which kind of plug in and then are able to sort of disengage in a shorter amount of time, something like 4 hours, 6 hours, something like that. I don't know if you had any more to say about that.
I love thinking about that. So let's go back to why we're even really talking about this today, which is that, mental health is at a breaking point. And depression, I mean, here's just some statistics that you may or may not know, but we're at a place where the FDA and our doctors and therapists are running out of really solid options for dealing with addiction and some of our most vexing societal problems like addiction and treatment-resistant depression or just depression, anxiety, suicidality, and PTSD is a really big one. As I said before, we don't really have great ways of reducing that suffering. And even things like the existential terror that comes with a terminal diagnosis. We don't have in our medical history really sufficient ways of addressing that, but that suffering is so real. I was just going to say, Jared put up this fact about treatment-resistant depression occurs in 50 to 60% of patients. Again, this shows you, like, even with medication, that medication can be really helpful for certain people, but for the majority of people, it's not very helpful, and it's not a long-term solution. So FDA and our government is like, what are we going to do about this? And so when psychedelic medicine the research started showing good effects, it was like, okay, we can focus on this. So
if I could jump in too, I think that on that slide, back to the discussion. No, the previous one. Yeah, that one. Back to the previous discussion about, like, what are some people's thoughts about psychedelics, and people are saying hippies and counterculture and all this, right?
Yeah.
What's so encouraging to me about psychedelics being used in modern medicine is that so many of the studies are focused on veterans, veterans with PTSD. They're focused on, a part of our culture that is very much not associated with hippies or, psychedelia in general. And it's because it's such an effective treatment for these issues that, not only veterans, who are one of the most venerated people in our society, but other people who are struggling so much. It's not about partying and, having fun and having this kind of rave-like experience. It's more about helping to heal these really deep issues, at least as it's now being expressed in modern healthcare, which is really encouraging to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to have the FDA and the DoD working towards helping our veterans get the kind of care that they need that hasn't been available to them in the past. Yeah. So one of the things that's fun to explore, and this actually comes from Robert Carhart Harris. He is the head of the Imperial College in the UK, their psychedelic lab there. He's a great researcher. But, he was sort of playing around with this idea of what are some of the common factors in mental illness. And if we look around the center circle that has negative biases and habits, you can see that all of these very difficult to treat mental illnesses, they do have some overlap. And one of those overlaps may be that the mind gets conditioned towards negative habits and biases. And oftentimes there becomes a rigidity in the way that the mind is thinking or orienting itself. So the question is, what do we do about that? Habit changing, cognitive behavioral therapy, they do help. A lot of times it tends to be more on an intellectual level, whereas the lasting change sometimes needs to be embodied. So you have other therapies that can definitely help do this. But the idea is that how do we relax and revise this, this collection of negative habits and biases? And so psychedelics seem to be able to do that. Again, what they do is they dissolve the barriers between physical senses, resulting in these this cross-pollination of perception and touches and smells and tastes. They are able to, when they turn on that default mode network, it's as if the tape that runs in our mind, that sort of our personality is attached to the stories, it's like it disengages from that, or creates more space in that narrative, or even sometimes it starts to rewrite that narrative a little bit because these connections are being made and you're starting to see a greater picture of your experience. There is a quality of neurogenesis, so it's actually creates new neurons in the brain, which is exciting. It's like opposite of that, here's your brain on drug PSA. Do you guys remember that from growing up, where it's like these eggs are in this, skillet and they're like disintegrating? Actually, psychedelics actually may grow parts of your brain. and create new networks. And it's almost like a system reboot. It's like, I think of it sometimes as the psychedelics are like, they defrag your system. So we have this collection of thoughts and ideas and stories that make up our experience. And some of them are useful and some of them are not. Oftentimes, a lot of them are not useful, especially if you have mental illness. And so it sort of like shakes them out, cleanses them, and detoxifies that. So what's left is like the pure operating system again. It doesn't mean that those thoughts won't kind of collect again occasionally, but maybe less than before. And maybe as they're collecting, you'll have more awareness on how to moderate or mediate that process. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that at all? Yeah.
You know, just that the neurogenesis and neuroplasticity is really interesting research that's happening. I think on one hand, it kind of validates this stone date theory because, you know, as we're sort of evolving and building ourselves into humans, it's really theoretically, you know, acceptable that these substances are kind of building that, building those neural connections and into a larger, sort of more complex brain. And I think it also has a lot of potential in terms of traumatic brain injuries and, you know, again, PTSD, especially when those two cross over, it can get really, really rough for people.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's just, yeah, it's really exciting.
Yeah. And this is like the groundwork for healing our stories, our issues, our ways of thinking, and even our nervous system responses, you know, that get activated, reactivated by our thought patterns. So this is one of my, I think Jared and I were talking, this is one of our favorite pictures. So this is the non-psychedelic brain right here. It's this, and then you're going to see that.
This is the brain not on drugs.
Yeah, this is the brain not on drugs, and this is the brain on drugs. Wow, look at that. Look at those connections. I love this picture because and there was this meditation teacher who told me this, and who knows where it goes back to, but that everything that we can imagine is actually already here. It's just that it's within our ability to sense, but we don't sense it a lot of the time. And here's a really good example of this. You see on this brain all of these connections that are happening, and the result of the connections again opens your eyes to so much more in your present reality. It can be fantastical, and it can also just be as simple as being able to be incredibly mindful of where you are and to be actually even in the miracle of the moment. It's like mindfulness, you know, like really dialed in. So parts of the brain that don't normally connect begin to connect, and this helps us put experience and self as story into a new perspective. Depressed people actually tend to have an overconnected brain, but the connections tend to be in the sense of self region, and those can be too strong. So another thing that psychedelics do is they sort of loosen up certain connections and then reinforce other connections. I think of it sometimes as like, in a way, like a house that has like an earthquake, right? And everything the foundation gets a little like loose. And during that time in your brain, you can start to decide how you want to rebuild that house. That's one way I think about it. But it gives you choices. It starts to give you the ability to make choices. And this is another concept that I've taken from Robert Carhart Harris. But in the process of rewiring the pathways, your brain no longer, or it has more choice in the road that it decides to take. So where we may be conditioned, neurologically conditioned to go down a road that engenders suffering for us, for whatever reason, whether it's a thought or a pattern of behavior or whatever, you start to be able to have more choice or even more of a greater pause. So you're sitting at this place where these two paths this path is diverging, and you actually can say, you know what, maybe this time I'm actually going to go to the right side of the path where there may be more access to joy or better thought patterns or better habits. There was this guy, there is this researcher, Tony Bossis, up in, I think he's at NYU. He's really wonderful. He said this, patients can use the intimate transpersonal context while being under psychedelics to edit their life stories. And by reconstructing identity, reforming purpose, and revising life narratives, they begin to accept or find meaning and transcend suffering. And in that process, patients experience healing. I love that because it's so hopeful, and it shows what can happen for to someone like who's been in trauma, that there's a ability to start reframing even the worst experiences of their life, to be able to have space and to have a chance to look at them a little bit differently and to begin to have agency again. There's a quick study I just want to tell you about, which is that a single dose of psilocybin was associated with increased mindfulness 3 months post-administration. And these are for folks who weren't even trained in mindfulness. It increased mindfulness significantly. So the question too is that, yes, they sound really great, but are they safe? Jared, you can take it away from here.
Yeah, this is a really interesting chart. You know, again, a lot of people are scared about psychedelics. There's a little bit of a built-up fear sometimes with them. And the truth of the matter is they're really, as you can see, they have a remarkably high safety profile. If you look at the bottom of this chart, you know, we have alcohol, we have cocaine and heroin all the way over at the left, even tobacco, ketamine, you know, there's all these different substances that are much more common in society and sometimes even used medically that have this really, really high profile for risk and for actual, you know, physical harm. Yeah. And if you look all the way over on the right-hand side, you know, mushrooms and psilocybin in particular have no representation in any kind of drug-specific mortality or damage or dependence in particular. And in fact, there's good research to show the opposite, that they inhibit any kind of dependence. And really what you see is, you know, just the danger of the drug sort of, if you skip back one more slide just for a second, the only danger you see there represented on this slide at least is the impairment of mental functioning, which is, you know, is real. And if we go ahead and move forward there, you know, it is real that mental, and, you know, sort of temporary impairment, but it's also part of the process. If you look here, this is a slide I pulled up from the DEA's website. This little bit of grainy dust next to the penny is a lethal dose of fentanyl, which, you know, with the opioid crisis, this is one of the things that has been really damaging and really fatal to so many people. And it's remarkable to me how small of a dose that is. That's a Schedule II drug, so that's considered safer than psilocybin, you know, mushrooms over there on the right, which again are currently scheduled as Schedule I. So that's why in part I'm excited to do these talks, to really help people to re-engage with their idea of what psychedelics are and how safe they are, and, you know, what cautions and contraindications they do have, so we can reapproach this conversation as a society a little bit better.
Okay, so there are contraindications, and it's not medicine that's for everybody. The researchers screen out personality disorders, bipolar, hypomania, psychosis, schizophrenia. And my personal opinion, even though there are some cultures where they give just the tiniest little drop of, say, like ayahuasca in the eyes of babies in a tribe in the Amazon, their culture is held in such a different way than ours. And really, it's my opinion that children who haven't really developed a sense of self yet don't need to be taking psychedelics, which start to loosen the sense of self. So I would say, you know, while people are actively developing their personality structure, psychedelics are probably not the best choice to be using. Yeah. So you can't have a talk about psychedelics without discussing the bad trip. I was looking at this, I was like, it doesn't seem so bad. That sounds actually like kind of interesting. But one of my teachers had said, and this is Bill Richards up from Hopkins, he said, there are no bad trips, but there's a therapeutic opportunity that the user may not be prepared to deal with. Really, you know, bad trips, essentially, they kind of do happen, but they happen out in the wild. When you're in a safe setting with someone who you trust and you have an appropriate dosage, bad trips don't really happen. You may have difficult subject matter, but you're able to approach it from a point of view that if you go into it, you're going to learn something from it, and that learning will help bring healing to you. There is a rare disorder called hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. You may have heard from the old days, like the flashbacks. That does happen, but it's really, 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 really rare. Okay, let's move on. So I pulled some of the research that got me the most excited. So you can take a peek at it, but I just wanted to call out, someone had asked about trauma, and I wanted to say that the trials from MAPS, which is an organization that works with MDMA, 83% of the participants in the MDMA study with PTSD no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis after 2 months of treatments. I was lucky enough to be trained in MDMA therapy this summer, or last summer, and I got to see some of these folks that they had done these trials with. And this is not just like minor PTSD, not like there is any minor PTSD, but these are people whose entire lives were just like non-doable. And after 1 or 2 treatments, the amount of peace that was witnessed it brought tears to the eyes of the therapists and the doctors in the room, because they'd never seen anything like this before. You can see that, one single dose of psilocybin with therapy produced rapid, enduring antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects for participants with cancer-related stress. And tobacco, which is a traditionally very difficult substance to kick, 67% of the participants in the tobacco study were abstinent 12 months after the study ended. I just think that's really remarkable. One thing that's come up in the studies is that the more mystical the experience reported by the patient, the more durable the effect of the therapy. So they found that research participants reported more lasting openness, a greater sense of healing, and an overall better treatment response. And this actually led to a screening, or more like a reporting for a questionnaire after sessions up at Johns Hopkins, rating your mystical experience, which I think is really neat. And that then led to research studies with a variety of spiritual leaders to see how psilocybin changed their experience of their spirituality. That was also done by Tony Vasas. When you look at what people say about it from their personal point of view, and these are people who were in research studies, it's really hard to deny that something real is happening here. You see themes on these trip reports from like, I had these incredible insights, these altered sense of self-perception, feelings of connectedness, feelings of getting down to the root cause of discomfort, transcendental experiences, and the ability to touch into emotions that were hidden before. This is just a real quick look at what it would feel like if you were in the Johns Hopkins psychedelic therapy room. That's Mary Casamano on the right-hand side, and a patient there. In these settings, you work with what we would call like either a guide or a sitter or a facilitator. That's what Mary's doing. She's holding the hand of the subject. It's very well controlled. Basically, the sitter doesn't do a whole lot, but is there to keep everybody safe and to be a support if needed. It's really important for a successful session to be mindful of the set, setting, and integration. So the set is like how you prepare your mindset for an experience. The setting is the place in which you do it and the safety of it. And the integration is being able to take your experience and work with a therapist to bring that experience into this reality for lasting change. Do you want to read this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're coming up here on the end of time. And this is a great quote from Stanislav Grof, who is probably on record as having done the most sessions with clients under LSD than anybody else in the world. I think it's over 4,000 or something that he did back in the 70s. The cartography that emerged from this work was a vast expansion beyond what we currently have in psychiatry and psychology. You can map the different layers of the psyche, a kind of chemical archaeology, opening up a vast domain of what we now call transpersonal experiences. The other major discovery was the self-healing potential of the psyche. When you change consciousness, it activates your self-healing potential, which I think really gets to the heart of it. It's really about getting a person to connect more deeply to their inner world. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we go on, I just wanted to answer a couple of messages in case people are going to have to leave. So we got one question about the dosage of the MDMA study. Typical dosage for MDMA is going to be somewhere, I think it's going to be somewhere between like 110 milligrams, and then oftentimes they'll give a bumper. So oftentimes it depends on the person on how much they give, but usually there's some amount that will bring up that will be therapeutic, and then they'll add to it if they need to. So sometimes there's a bumper of like 50 milligrams. So it could be like 120 and then a 50 bumper or something like that. And then someone asked the question of, can you write out what the researcher, what does that say, from NYU said? Yes, I'll do that at the end. Okay, let's see, where are we? So where are we today? Lots is happening, lots is happening all over the place. We have dozens of trials going on throughout the world. In the US, there are many studies going on, things like treatment-resistant depression, anorexia. We have some autism studies that happened recently, which is really exciting with MDMA. Currently, psilocybin is in phase 2 trials and MDMA is in phase 3. And I get really excited at the thought of what will happen when we can expand the research to include things that we deal with here at CIH, like chronic fatigue syndrome or post-Lyme disease fatigue or pain, things like that. Like how, when we give psilocybin, how would that affect both the identification of ourselves with those illnesses and even just the illness itself. Who knows when it's going to all be here, but it looks like it's coming within like 2 to 5 years. So it's right around the corner. Right up the street, there's a lot happening. There's Shepherd Pratt and Hopkins doing research in Baltimore, and a new center, the Aquilino Center at Shady Grove Adventist, is going to be starting trials with psilocybin and MDMA in about a month. And there'll be many more in the future. If you want to get yourself involved and you don't want to go into the research setting, you can, and you live in DC, you can get involved in Initiative 81. Jared, do you want to talk about it for a sec?
Yeah, so this is going to be on the ballot this election. So just in, a couple of weeks here, DC residents are going to be able to vote on whether or not to decriminalize plant medicines. So this includes psychedelic fungi, cacti, plants, basically any sort of psychedelic substance. And they're looking to reform the laws based on current research. They're looking to, take steps towards ending the war on drugs by decriminalizing these substances. Unfortunately, DC laws are a little complex, so decriminalization is the best that they can do right now without Congress taking a little bit of a different stance on DC politics. But there are so many other places. I mean, I forget how many, if you know this, it's well over 100 other cities and jurisdictions have either gone ahead and legalized or decriminalized plant medicines, or have them on the ballot for this election. So yeah, touch base with it, Initiative 81 or Decriminalize Nature DC. Really, really great people over there.
We had someone mention that, and we should do this, that in Maryland, psychedelics are not legal. There's no Decriminalize Nature Maryland yet. But, if you're interested, you could do it. You could start that process. So anybody who loves psychedelics and sees the therapeutic value of them can become a voice to help move this movement along. So, We can take some questions if people are still around. And we've got resources here, so you can take a peek at that. I mean, all you have to do is just type in psychedelics and whatever you're interested in, and you're going to see a ton of stuff. Psychedelics Times is a really good resource. That's online. They have that timeline that Jared was talking about. Yeah. Okay. If anybody has any questions, they can, I don't know if we can raise hands. I don't know if anybody's still, we have 30 participants still here. If there's anything else we can answer, we can ask away. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many things that come up. This is a great talk. Liz and Jared, thank you so much.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting that I feel like the root cause of a lot of illness is ego, you know, is the focus on the self, the default mode network. So you had said that in the middle of the talk. Do you think that it would be helpful to have therapy and other modalities to support if people did psychedelics? You know, I'm just curious, or would this be enough? You know, I'm just kind of curious how that would integrate with other therapies to help to change the default mode network.
I feel like my approach to
acupuncture, you know, etc.
and healing in general is that the more thoughtful approaches to an issue one can have support with, the better. You know, when I have patients that come in for acupuncture and they're also seeing a therapist and a chiropractor, certain things will move a lot better, you know? Yeah. So I really think that the more types of therapists and, you know, whether it's acupuncturists, therapists, psychiatrists, doctors that can be there as support to help people navigate these substances and navigate the integration work after it, you know, it's just going to be so much better. It's going to land so
we can choose the sunshine here instead of the dark rain cloud. Christine asks, where would one need to go to try this treatment? We saw that it's not legal yet in DC or Maryland. Is it a research setting now that we're limited to?
Well,
or
if you wanted to do it legally in this country, you would be enrolling in a research trial. And they do have, you know, they have all sorts of trials that are going on. You can go on to, I think you could even go on to like the Johns Hopkins website to see which trials are present. But you know, you can go down to Costa Rica, you can go to Jamaica, you can go to the Netherlands.
So it's legal for a US resident to travel there.
Oh yeah.
And do it there, I see,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a couple of different places in Jamaica where they have ceremonies there. There's obviously a lot of places in the Amazon for ayahuasca ceremonies, but you know, to do it legally in a ritual setting or a setting that is really honors the medicine, you need to travel outside of the United States.
Even if you go someplace like Oakland or Denver in particular has a culture that's really building up now because they decriminalize.
Yes, exactly.
So you can go there and do it legally from a perspective of being in that city, but it still has that federal Schedule 1 status. So
yeah,
as Liz was saying, you really, you know, to do it fully legally, you either need to be enrolled in a clinical trial, you know, here by one of the universities, or to a country where it is fully legal.
I will say I'm going to give a plug for both ketamine and cannabis. So ketamine is Schedule 4. It can be given sublingually. It's used for suicidality, but it, as I said before, it has a it's like a psychedelic essentially. It's a very short window of time. It's about an hour and a half long that you're in that experience, and there are ketamine assisted psychotherapy groups that you can keep your eye out for. You could also contact me if you wanted to talk about that. But it's another way to have a psychedelic experience that is completely legal, available to you, and is done at its best in a ritual type setting or in a group setting or with a therapist one-on-one. And then cannabis also, like I said, the guy Daniel McQueen out in Boulder is a real proponent of using cannabis ceremonially as a psychedelic substance. And that's also something, if you're interested in that and wanted to learn more, you could reach out to me personally at CIH about how that's done, but it has a lot of value as well. Yeah. Can you explain how these are administered? Sure. In the research setting, I think they used to use actual, mushrooms, but now, now they're pills. They're pills of psilocybin or psilocin, and they get it from different sources that make these pills, and they're working with the FDA to make sure that the process is correct and all that kind of stuff. If you were to go down to, say, like Jamaica, to Myco Meditations, they may have it as brewed as a tea, or you might eat the actual mushrooms. They can be powdered and put in pineapple juice or chocolate or whatever, to make it more palatable. Ayahuasca is taken as a brew. It's a combination of several plants that are brewed together and taken as a drink. Ketamine can be intravenous or sublingual. I think that's kind of how it's administered. And I don't know what else. There's other ways to do the different ones, but we don't need to go into all those details, I don't think.
And I think too, part of that is also they're administered in safe clinical or sacred settings where there is a contained quality where you're not having TV or sort of disconcerting music playing or anything like that. It's more sort of this almost womb-like structure where you're able to have this experience in a safe way. While somebody is watching and making sure everything is done, safe, while you are able to kind of dissolve some of your structures, and that's a huge aspect of how it's administered as well. I think beyond just the the physicality of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like set and setting and integration are the name of the game. The substance is the substance, and it does do something, but in terms of really getting the value out of it therapeutically, you have to have those components in place. So you have to have your mind prepared for it. You need to be at a place where you're coming in with some sort of intentionality to it, and even a sense of humility to it. And you need to have a space where it's safe to have it done, where you're not going to be distracted, where you have someone that you trust that's with you. And then afterwards to be able to talk through your experience and to start to explore modifications in your behavior that will be supportive at lengthening the therapeutic effect of the experience.
And if you look at Oregon right now, they have something on the ballot where they're looking to create essentially not only decriminalize the drug, but create community-centered, community-supported psilocybin centers where there is a place you can go, there's a community, there's a network of practitioners that are administering and supporting, not only the administration of the substance, but again, the integration afterwards.
And group administration is really powerful. So, I mean, we know like AA and NA have developed and, Overeaters like Anonymous, like this group setting for healing has been shown to be powerful. And when you bring psychedelics into it, it amplifies that. And you end up learning from one another, where you might be stuck in your idea that you're the only person who feels this way, or there's something wrong with you. You're unique into that feeling. We get to share the experience, learn from the experience, see that we're actually kind of, in some ways like all the same. Our suffering is real. We get to witness that. And then we get to learn from what other people have experienced, because the experiences are also happening in us as well.
Yeah, shared transpersonal experiences are powerful.
Grab this quote. Someone, I think it was Mustafa, wanted this quote, so I'm going to put it in here. Send to everyone. I don't know how to do that, but okay, here. There we go. If there's no other questions, we'll probably go ahead and turn it off, but we're really grateful that you are here to spend time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Wong and CIH.
Thank you so much,
yeah,
Liz and Jared. We will be back next Friday with Dr. Keats, not Thursday, but next Friday, which is the 23rd of October, and then we'll be back for the regular Thursdays after that. So everyone have a great rest of the week and weekend, and we will see you all soon.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.